Do you like luxury? The English, it's safe to say, probably adore it. It is possible to draw such a conclusion if you look at their automobile concerns. Wherever you look, you see a luxury car brand. Bentley, Aston Martin, Rolls-Royce, and the subject of our discussion today represent such elite in the automobile market. Maybe there is a lucky owner of such a car among you. If so, tell us your business plans in the comments because you, by all appearances, are a big businessman, and if not a millionaire, then at least close to it. Okay, we're kidding, of course, but joking doesn't make the price of English stamps any lower. Anyway, never mind. Today, we will tell the story of the brand that can be driven in the desert, in deep mud, and maybe even on the water. And through all the shit all over the place, okay? It is Land-Rover, one of the most known manufacturers of automobiles to off-roaders. It is possible to tell about its history. It appeared in that time and that place. It is the story of how a bright idea gave start to one of the most respected brands in the history of automotive engineering. This is the story of absolutely unexpected success and, as it is not difficult to guess, equally unexpected failure. Though Land Rover has not failed, its parent company has ceased to exist at all. It is necessary to remember that the history is moved by the conflict. It is not interesting without it. Did we tell you boring stories? You already know the answer. We'll tell you how someone else's car could give you the idea to create about the same thing, but only better. And we'll tell you how the story of a giant copying of an old car ended. So while you get in the right mood for reading Dickens, we're about to start. History of Land Rover. To understand the original idea of Land Rover, it's necessary to understand what the founders expected from their production in general. The company was founded by two very talented and smart people, Maurice and Spencer Wilks. Now, you have Maurice Wilks in front of you, so we'll start with him. Because he had more influence on the company than his own brother, but they both did a lot of things, so we'll talk about them. Maurice was born on the 19th of August, 1904 in Hampshire, England. He came from a wealthy family. His father, Thomas Wilks, was the director of the leather company. We don't know what it did, but we do know it was quite successful. We know this because the Wilks were pretty well off. Young Wilks got an education at Malvern College and quickly found a job. We should be like that now, shouldn't we? So for 4 years until 1926, Maurice Wilks worked at Hillman Motors. That year, he left his native country and went to America to work for General Motors. He didn't work there for a long time. He was drawn home and 2 years later was back in England. It's worth saying that all great companies have something in common. Their founders are always engineers. If not talented, then at least some kind of. It's unclear whether Wilks was talented before he created his main brainchild, but he was already an engineer, so he worked at Hillman Motors in that position. In 1930, he learned about the existence of the Rover Company, where his older brother already worked, and on invitation, went there, immediately taking the post of chief engineer. A case where nepotism did not lead to disaster. Amazing. By the way, Spencer himself was also hired first by recommendation and then by invitation of this man. His name is Frank Searle, and by the time Maurice came in, he was already on the board of directors. As a result, in 1930, the brothers made a momentous decision. They would never skimp on production and would always produce only high-quality cars. We'll find out later how they didn't skimp on cars. It was kind of a joke. In 1932, fortune fell on the Wilks' head. Spencer got the position of managing director at Rover. Fate loves irony, though. We've already said in our previous video that probably all the car companies made something related to aviation during wartime. Why? Engineers were never out of work during a war, all the more so. That's why the Wilks at Rover during World War II created engines for airplanes. These engines had a feature that would greatly influence their style and character for the future of a great brand. They were gas turbines. That is, they were built around a gas turbine that drove a supercharger. It was a sort of revolution in engine construction, so they were actively used. True, in 1943, the company was already so tired of working with it that they gave the project to Rolls-Royce, but the Wilks remembered this development. Looking ahead, we'll say that Rover would produce a car with such an engine in 1949, but that's not much of a story anymore. We are slowly getting closer to the foundation of Land Rover, but we're still a bit away. The car had two inspirations, two geniuses who created this car. Now, we've told you about the first one, and we've mentioned the second only in passing, so let's talk about Spencer Wilks. So we won't dwell on the earliest stages of his life, except to say he was born in 1891. He was nearly 15 years older than Maurice, which didn't prevent him from outliving his brother by a decade. At first, he'd wanted to be a lawyer, but his wife was Hillman Motors founder's daughter. A peripecia ensued in which he decided to give up the dream and took over as co-manager in 1921, when William Hillman died. However, he didn't hold that position too long. In 1929, he spat out the company's business and left for Rover because of a disagreement with Roots Motor Limited, which then slowly seized the reins of power. Already at Rover, Spencer, far from being stupid, made a brilliant career for himself and took his place on the board of directors in the same year. The following year, he would be joined by his brother Maurice. As we can see already at this point, the two brothers had a strong affinity for each other, and the younger wanted to be like the elder. It didn't work out, but together they worked as a very cool symbiosis. Spencer's talent would eventually prove successful enough to become the head of Rover. It's a matter of how you look at it, though. He took that post as much as 35 years later. Not to say it's too fast, really, no surprises there, but it wouldn't affect Land Rover cars. And yes, he would die of grief if he knew that sooner or later the company that would become his home would just cease to exist. Before telling the story of Land Rover itself, we need to outline the introductory data. First, we have an excellent engineer and talented manager in the face of two brothers. Secondly, the idea to create a car came already after the Second World War, when the economy of England, well, in short, the economy of England was screwed up. Not as bad as in the USSR or in Germany, of course, but pretty significantly. Thirdly, both brothers were engaged in the development of engines for airplanes. They had experience and they had talent, so they could make a car with their own hands. The government of England had lost its human nature and demanded that automakers make expensive cars that would appeal to foreign buyers. This was necessary in order to restore the economy at the expense of the currency. A task, as you can understand, almost impossible. Although, no, you don't understand it yet. We didn't say that the metals were in short supply, especially steel, from which car bodies were made back then. This was despite the fact that many companies were practically going bankrupt. It was absurd, but what to do? It was necessary to adapt. By the way, Rover was producing cars before the war which were totally unsuitable for such conditions. Now here's an interesting fact. There was a year in England that, if it didn't destroy the entire roadway, it did do considerable damage to it. It was the inclement weather of 1947. The winter was so severe that wind, rain, and snow turned decent roads into bad ones, and bad ones into impassable. Because of this, everyone suffered. Maurice Wilkes, an old acquaintance of ours, was suffering too. On several occasions, he had already abandoned his car a few miles from home. He was fed up with it, but he had no idea how to fix it. And so, one far from a perfect evening, Maurice's neighbor, a colonel with the last name Nash, suggested that Maurice use an old model Jeep called the Willys WB. The model was, as we said, old and had tremendous mileage, but it managed to charm Maurice, so much so that he almost immediately bought the car from his neighbor. The reasons were obvious. The Jeep could perfectly deal with the roads that no ordinary car could cope with. Of course, it was a military model, but it was perfectly suited for use in rural areas. Such a model, an irreplaceable help for farmers. By the way, here's a photo with the Wilkes brothers posing with that very Willys WB. It's an original, no scam. Now, we're finally starting to talk about the Land Rover itself. Why not, thought Wilkes, and ran to the Rover directors with a new idea. They didn't say the idea was immediately approved, but they were generally supportive, and why not? The idea of a low-cost model which is easy to produce and still able to pass even the worst roads could pay off and appeal to foreign customers. At least for the conveyor production, this car looked much better than the others. The project was given the go-ahead and called Project J. Now, here, I want to rewind time a little bit and explain why, in conditions of scarcity and the high cost of metals, such a machine was given the go-ahead. See, when you work in a factory that makes aluminum engines, any metal can be in short supply, but not aluminum. Yes, it's more expensive than steel, but there's so much of it that you don't need to buy it. Plus, it's both lighter and of better quality than other available metals. So the Wilkes were very lucky enough because they had plenty of material. The man you see on the screen now is named Gordon Bashford, and he was to develop the chassis for the new model. He visited a military equipment warehouse and bought as many as 4 Willys WBs. You can already see why. Engineers completely disassembled these models to understand how everything worked in them, and then, rethinking the design of Jeep, began to create their own version of such a car. In front of you is a photo reconstruction of the first drawings of the new model. The original drawings unfortunately haven't survived. Now, in fact, this model is quite difficult to call a unique vision. The first prototype even had the chassis from our good old Willys WB. It simply had an engine of 1.6 liters and a 4-speed gearbox. It didn't need a lot of testing. The company continued to work on the new model when it became certain that such a prototype could in fact be driven, and it didn't even need to be pushed from the back of a mountain. When Rover realized this, they set about making a full-fledged driving prototype. And here, it is not clear whether their imagination had failed, or on the contrary had increased in power, considering what they had developed. So here we go. This may be one of the most bizarrely designed machines you've ever seen. The name of this devil's spawn is Center Steer. All you can say about it is that the steering wheel was centered, the name speaking for itself, just like in the old literary plays. And yes, it sounds like a sensible idea, but the ending didn't taste well. Remember, we once said the Wilks brothers promised to develop only high-quality and expensive cars? It's a great joke, by the way, because the center steering wheel was created just to make the production of the model cheaper. Where else could it be made cheaper while it is driven on someone else's chassis and there's nothing in it except that it basically can be driven? Well, they found a way. They took someone else's chassis and put the steering wheel in the center. What could go wrong? Actually, everything went wrong. The car didn't seem to be designed for humans, just like the government of England in those years. Sitting in this accomplishment of modern auto engineering was uncomfortable. There was virtually no room for the driver's feet. Also, the clutch pedal was on the left side of the steering gimbal and the gas and brake were on the right. Pretty freaking uncomfortable, wasn't it? And all this with the steering wheel in the center. Stunning, right? Great damn car. Also, the driver's hands couldn't reach the window, so he couldn't signal the turn signals. And there were no turn signals for this worker, of course, so an accident was almost guaranteed. And with a device like that, even a small accident could lead to the most unexpected results, such as death. Cool. But what's cool is that this car turned out to be unique. God forbid anyone should think of copying it. Well, a year went by. Engineers thought a little better than when they put the steering wheel in the center and came up with the first decent Land-Rover prototype. By the way, we want to tell you an interesting story. It has to do with the name of this brand. In short, imagine a forest. Early morning, August. 3 hapless hunters are sitting by the fire and warming up. Somewhere a bird call is heard. Bang, bang! A few shots echoed and faded away. Failure again. Spencer Wilks returned from the bushes where the shots had been fired and bowed his head. Failure again, he muttered to himself. That's sad, answered Thomas, Spencer's son, but what is there to be sad about? Let's go to the fire, you'll be warm at least. Spencer listened to his son, and together they went back to Richard, Spencer's nephew. They sat, had a few drinks and sandwiches, and no one thought of the bad shots anymore. By the way, Uncle, how is your new project going? Richard took a sip of beer and continued. A Willys-powered cross-country vehicle, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, everything is all right. The only thing that bothers me is we can't think of a name for this thing. It hadn't even occurred to me that this could actually be a problem. Roverland? His nephew was far from dumb. That's how you designate both the fact that it's a Rover vehicle and its purpose. Yeah, that's cool, except there's already a car called Willys Overland. And you know how people can talk. No, okay. Oh, I know, you can call it a Land-Rover. Now, this sketch is not fiction. It's official information from the Chronicles of Land Rover itself. Funny thing is, it wasn't the genius father who named the car, but the savvy nephew. So, the significant moment. The time of appearance of the first official Land Rover is the 11th of March, 1948. And it was, thank God, very different from the first prototype. First, the steering wheel got its usual arrangement. The design was rectangular and sharp. The body was made of an aluminum magnesium alloy. The car was four-wheel drive, and its advantage was that it was as simplified as possible. Even the door handles were missing. It was necessary to open the car by sticking your hand into the door collar and opening the car from the inside. The engine was also simple, 1.6 liters. It had only 50 horsepower. And what the hell is that, you're already thinking? Wait, we know, but listen to the story. When the economy of the country is like one big asshole and people can barely afford not only cars but even bread, this is the kind of car that'll do just fine. So that such solutions are, in fact, brilliant. So this car was presented to the public on April 30th of 1948 and immediately won the hearts of the British. So the car came out and immediately became a benefit for the British. Orders for the car in the first months reached 8,000 applications. It is an inconceivable success, especially if you take into account the fact that originally the company had not planned to produce more than 400 cars a month. Then production would be doubled, but up to the middle of the 50s, Land Rovers would be in short supply. Want to see some interesting pictures? One of the cars was given to a pretty cool guy named Winston Churchill. Here's a picture. He thought the car would be popular with farmers. He was wrong. The car became popular among all Englishmen in general. Firstly, it drove everywhere. Secondly, the simplicity of the design provided excellent reliability and cheap repair. In short, it was an excellent car. Thus, it became a separate brand of cars. But this is only the beginning of the history of the car. We delayed a little bit at the beginning. But it doesn't matter because it's interesting. For you, probably. We hope so. Anyway. Also, the interesting thing about the first model was that it seemed to be one of the few cars from this company that didn't cost a huge amount of money. Surprising, considering what we said about luxury English brands. Although, by the way, if that very same rock hits a Land Rover, it would not give a damn. Almost bulletproof, huh? In 1951, the Land Rover brand received a royal warrant from Britain's King George VI. It's cool when a car has been around for a better part of 3 years and has already been honored in this way. Since the era of the Land Rover First Series, each car was distinguished, above all, by the fact that it was one of the few four-wheel drive vehicles in the world, as well as by its chassis, which allowed it to go where not only a passenger car, but even a man on foot could be able to pass. There were released several different models of Land Rover, among which the rather funny Series 2, aka Defender. It differs from the first series in that it was no longer a car for farmers. On the contrary, it was more comfortable than some sports cars of that time, and of course it drove everywhere. Land Rover will never lose its main feature. Now, the company was going to have a tough time because there aren't any companies that don't have tough times, so Rover went bankrupt in 1967, after which it was taken over by the large concern Leyland Motors, and then became an affiliate of British Leyland. But we know why you're here. We have to tell you about this car. Otherwise, you're just going to eat us up in the comments, right? Now, you're lucky that Land Rover seems to have such a limited range. As early as the 70s, the Range Rover was developed and presented to the public. You can meet it with thunderous applause. It was fundamentally different from previous models. We could tell about its characteristics, but really, are you interested? We're telling about a whole family romance epic here. The history of the company is more interesting, so we'll limit ourselves to the fact that the car had a lightweight body, doors that opened without too much effort, and tilting tailgate at the back. Certainly, it was far from the cherry on the cake of design ideas, but the design is the last thing that comes to mind when speaking about Land Rover. So the car was, quite legitimately, an unthinkable success with the public, so much so that Range Rover is produced as much as 50 years later. A truly epochal event in the life of the brainchild, the Wilks didn't see with their own eyes. What are we talking about? The fact that in 1975, Land Rover stopped being spelled with a hyphen. Just kidding. This was the year Land Rover was no longer a subsidiary project, but a major car brand. Incidentally, the major brand left the US market last year because the Japanese, similar in design, crushed it. That's funny. But they didn't last long out there. While new cars were coming out, old Land Rovers and Range Rovers were actively marketed in the US at flea markets. So in the year 1987, they made a grand return to our market, and just in time, because they turned out to be very much in demand here. And in 1989, they introduced the model Discovery, which remains popular to this day thanks to this. History of Land Rover brand is tightly intertwined with Rovers, so that any of its shocks in one way or the other is reflected in Land Rover. So much so that in 1994, Rover went bankrupt again and became owned by BMW. Land Rover became owned by BMW as well, which is ironic, but this is not a Bentley. The fact that the company changed owners did not affect the product, which is great. By the way, in the same year appeared the new second-generation Range Rover, also very good. One of the significant models, in 1997, the Discovery model was introduced. In 2000, another shock. All countries, as they say, shuddered. Rover ceased to exist. Now, this was BMW's wish. How awful, but it didn't really concern Land Rover. By the way, already at this point, they ceased to be cheap cars with the simplest construction and became one of the most expensive English brands. By now, the company was owned by Ford. They owned it until 2008, that is until the world crisis when Ford itself suffered. By the way, another interesting fact, now there was no separate company Land Rover, but there is Jaguar Land Rover Limited. The two companies have long been separated, but after complex twists and turns of an unexpected plot united, so that now Land Rover produces luxury Jaguar as well. So in 2008, Ford had a problem. What could they sacrifice? Well, anything but themselves and their identity. So they sold the united concern of the largest Indian company, Tata Motors, to which Land Rover belongs even now. But here's what's interesting. No matter who owns the company, it never changes, and the model range does not get worse. If Bentley was dead for 70 years after it was bought, by the way, see a video about it on our channel, then Land Rover probably can be disassembled into atoms and they'll still be alive. Pretty versatile company. We should talk a little about interesting models. Yeah, of course, the Range Rover, Discovery, and Defender have been updated primarily as the most popular cars throughout history. But those were just updates that changed the design of the cars. Let's say more about the most interesting things. Just 4 years ago, Land Rover announced the creation of, shall we say, highly entertaining cars. It was the Cortex project, which is now in development. In short, this car is supposed to be a robot with an extremely intelligent AI. 3 years ago, the company said that a remote control system would be developed for the new Defender, but we're waiting for Elon Musk to purchase Land-Rover now because he loves such things. So, here we are with the Land-Rover story. And we could have talked more about the models, but geez, what models? This car has gone from a carbon copy of the ancient Willys to a separate top brand. This brand has survived seemingly every crisis, and it hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is that it is now a very prestigious British brand, yes, but the basic concept remains the same. It's a very cool story. Yes, with its failures, but we know that willpower is when you get up after the fall. So we can wish everyone to be like Land Rover. Whatever tries to break you, never give up. So how do you feel about today's Land Rover models? And have you been impressed by the story? Let us know in the comments.